The spring fete of St. Bartholomew's Chapel had never before been accused of ambition. Its aspirations extended no further than a dependable Victoria sponge, a modest tombola, and the annual raffle for a wicker hamper, whose contents were rumoured to have enjoyed previous fates under slightly altered wrapping. The chapel itself, an earnest brick structure of late Victorian enthusiasm, stood at the edge of Flaxborough's Market Square like a matron keeping an eye upon proceedings while declining to participate. On the afternoon in question, the square was comfortably alive. A trestle table bore neat pyramids of jam jars, each labelled in Mrs. Mountsee's assertive handwriting. The ladies' committee hovered with expressions of hopeful vigilance. The vicar, the Reverend Cuthbert Hale, circulated in a hat unsuited to the wind and spoke encouragingly of community spirit, which he pronounced as though it were a mild ailment from which the town might soon recover. At precisely 3:25, Mrs. Lionel Bream, Honorary Treasurer of the Chapel Restoration Fund, discovered that the Restoration Fund was, in a manner of speaking, not entirely restored. It happened during the counting of raffle proceeds in the vestry, a chamber whose odour of hymnals and furniture polish was ordinarily a reassurance. Mrs. Bream, a woman of administrative neatness and conversational thoroughness, had removed her gloves and arranged the banknotes in strict denominations. Opposite her sat Mr. Edwin Pert, assistant churchwarden and reluctant mathematician, who had agreed to witness the tally on the understanding that tea would follow. "I make it £274.10, Mrs. Bream announced, aligning the final note with the care of a librarian replacing a volume. Mr. Pert blinked at the ledger. "The target was 300, I believe." "Yes," said Mrs. Bream, not yet alarmed, though allowances must be made for the weather and for Mrs. Dalloway's rather unsuccessful coconut shy. She turned the page of the ledger and paused. The Restoration Fund, which had been the subject of earnest appeals for several months, should, by her previous calculations, have stood at £1,812. It did not. The figure recorded in her own hand, she was certain it was her hand, though it now seemed faintly accusatory, rested at £1,612. Mrs. Bream looked again, as if the missing £200 might be concealed in a margin or tucked discreetly behind a decimal. "Mr. Pert," she said carefully, "did you at any stage borrow £200 from the Chapel Restoration Fund for purposes of spiritual emergency?" Mr. Pert's spectacles slid fractionally down his nose. "Certainly not. I have never borrowed anything spiritual." The silence that followed was not yet dramatic. It was simply confusing. By 3:45, confusion had acquired companions. Mrs. Mountsie was fetched from her jam stall. The Reverend Hale was interrupted mid-conversation about roofing tiles, and by 4 o'clock the vestry contained a semicircle of respectable anxiety. "It must be a clerical error," declared Mrs. Mountsie, with the conviction of one who had never tolerated clerical errors in her own recipes. Mrs. Bream, however, prided herself upon figures. They had been her solace since widowhood and her defence against frivolity. She produced bank statements, receipts, and a small envelope labelled "Organ Appeal, Miscellaneous," in handwriting that was almost aggressively tidy. The numbers declined to cooperate. Outside, the fete continued with oblivious cheer. Children pursued each other between stalls. A dog investigated the raffle hamper with professional interest. And Mr. Cyril Dalloway loudly maintained that the coconut shy had been sabotaged by inferior fruit. Inside the vestry, reputations began to shift imperceptibly. "It may be," ventured to the Reverend Hale, "that a deposit was delayed." "I make deposits every Tuesday," said Mrs. Bream, "without exception, even during influenza." The remark carried weight. It was at this point that someone, no one later wished to admit precisely Who suggested that the matter might require official attention? The suggestion hovered in the air like an unwelcome hymn verse. Inspector Perbrite was not immediately summoned. Flaxborough possessed a robust confidence in its own decency and preferred to exhaust internal explanations before admitting external scrutiny. The phrase mislaid was employed twice, oversight once, and temporary discrepancy with hopeful optimism. Nevertheless, by early evening, the discrepancy had acquired a firmness inconsistent with mislaying. Word travelled through the market square with a speed that would have impressed the postal service. By 6 o'clock, it had reached the bar of the Grapes, where it acquired embellishment. By 7, it had settled into drawing rooms as a subject for cautious indignation. £200, murmured Mrs. Dalloway to her neighbour. One does not simply misplace £200. One might misplace a thimble. And yet, replied her neighbour, it is the sort of sum that tempts the unimaginative. Thus, before any accusation had been formed, motive began to circulate freely. At 8:15, the Reverend Hale, who had spent an hour in prayerful arithmetic, telephoned the police station with an apology so elaborate that it required interruption. Inspector Perbrite listened without comment. He asked 2 questions: whether the ledger had been kept continuously by Mrs. Bream, and whether anyone else had access to it. The answers were reassuring and unhelpful in equal measure. "I shall call tomorrow morning," he said, in a tone suggesting that morning would be perfectly adequate for whatever irregularities might have occurred. After replacing the receiver, he regarded the rain beginning to ripple the station window. Flaxborough's troubles were rarely flamboyant. They tended, instead, toward the faintly embarrassing. £200 from a chapel fund. It was not, he reflected, the sort of crime that required haste. It required patience and an ear for the tones in which respectable people discussed money. Inspector Perbrite arrived at St. Bartholomew's Chapel the following morning with the air of a man who had not come to judge anyone, but who was quite prepared to notice. The rain had settled into a steady, industrious drizzle, polishing the gravestones and making the chapel steps look as though they had recently been advised to behave themselves. Inside, the building smelled of damp stone and conscientiousness. Mrs. Lionel Bream met him on the porch. In daylight, she appeared even more carefully assembled than she had sounded on the telephone, as if the prospect of official interest had compelled her to tighten her collar and her principles by the same degree. "Inspector," she said, with the faint emphasis Flaxborough reserved for strangers who might later become acquaintances. "Thank you for coming so promptly." Perbrite's manner suggested that he had arrived at exactly the pace the situation deserved. "Good morning, Mrs. Bream. I understand we are missing a sum." £200, she said at once, as though naming it might cause it to return. "From the Chapel Restoration Fund. I can show you everything." "I should be grateful," Perbrite replied, and allowed her to lead him to the vestry. Mr. Edwin Pert was already there, seated with the stiff discomfort of a man who had been invited to witness his own innocence for an indeterminate period. The Reverend Hale hovered near the window, looking out at the rain with the fixed smile of someone hoping the weather might distract the inspector. On the table lay the ledger, bank statements, and a neat row of receipts like children lined up for inspection. Mrs. Bream sat opposite Perbrite and opened the book with a brisk tenderness. "I keep it to myself," she said. "No one else writes in it. The receipts are dated and cross-referenced. Deposits are every Tuesday, as I told you." Perbrite leafed through the pages, not quickly, but with a calm attentiveness that made each entry feel as though it had been asked to stand and explain itself. The handwriting remained unwaveringly proper. The figures marched in tidy columns. Respectability, it seemed, could be beautifully recorded even when it had been slightly reduced. And the sum, he said, was discovered yesterday, after the fete, during the raffle count, said Mrs. Bream. I noticed at once. The total should have been 1,812. It was 1,612. Perbrite paused over an entry and did not point at it. The 200 is missing from the running total rather than from the cash taken yesterday. Yes, Mrs. Bream's voice tightened, as if the distinction were personally insulting. Yesterday's money is accounted for. Perbrite looked up. Who had access to this room? Last week? The vicar, of course, said Mrs. Bream, and then, aware of the implications, added quickly, Not that I suggest I understand, Perbrite said. His eyes moved to the Reverend Hale, who at once developed a more devoted interest in the window latch. And Mr. Pert, Mrs. Bream continued, as assistant churchwarden he can enter. There is also a key held by Mrs. Mountsie for cleaning, though she is not usually in here alone. Mr. Pert made a small noise of protest, as though keys were being unfairly associated with character. I have the key, yes, but I only come in for meetings or when asked. I've never touched the ledger, except to witness the counting. Perbrite did not contradict him. He turned another page, and his gaze rested on a receipt that was slightly less crisp than the others, its corner softened as if it had been handled more often. Mrs. Bream noticed his attention immediately. That is for the scaffolding deposit, she said. We paid in advance. It was approved by the committee. And the committee, Perbrite asked, meets where? In the church hall, Reverend Hale put in, eager to be useful. Though we sometimes come in here afterward for the paperwork. Perbrite nodded, as if noting the difference between a hall and a vestry might later matter. And the bank deposit every Tuesday, who accompanies you? No one, said Mrs. Bream, with modest pride. I do it myself. Perbrite closed the ledger gently. If we accept that the arithmetic is correct, then the question is not whether the 200 exists, but when it ceased to exist in the fund. What was the last point you were certain the balance was correct? Mrs. Bream's eyes narrowed, not at him, but at her own memory. The end of February. I reconciled everything after the heating bill. Perbrite made a small note. Mr. Pert shifted in his chair, his thoughts moving in nervous loops. February meant time, and time meant opportunity, and opportunity was precisely what respectable people disliked being accused of having. Outside the vestry, footsteps sounded in the corridor. Brisk, indignant steps. Mrs. Mountsie entered without knocking, as though knocking might imply she had something to hide. I've come to clear this up, she announced, because it's already been said that someone has dipped their hand in the plate, and I can tell you now, Inspector, it will not be pinned on the ladies' committee. Perbrite rose slightly, not fully standing, but giving her enough attention to take the edge off her arrival. Good morning, Mrs. Mountsie. I understand you hold a key. For cleaning, she said sharply, and for locking up when the vicar forgets, which is not uncommon. If someone's been careless with money, I should look first at those who are careless with everything else. Reverend Hale coloured faintly. Now Mrs. Mountsie Perbrite intervened with polite calm. Mrs. Mountsie, when you clean, do you ever move papers from this table? I wipe around them, she said, as if the very suggestion were an insult to hygiene. I don't read them, but I have seen people come in here after meetings, people who linger, people who say they're just straightening things. And who, Perbrite asked, would that be? Mrs. Mountsie hesitated. It was a hesitation of principle wrestling with pleasure. At last, she said, Mrs. Dalloway, for one. Always volunteering for something that involves handling. And Mr. Cyril Dalloway, too, hanging about like a dog at a butcher's. And there's young Mr. Crimp from the builders came in to talk about the roof. He was alone with Mrs. Bream for 10 minutes. She'll tell you herself. Mrs. Bream stiffened, her mind flicking instantly through the memory of that meeting The contractor's oily politeness and the way he had admired the ledger's neatness as though neatness were a kind of weakness. She had not thought of it as important. Now it sat in her mind with a new, uncomfortable weight. Perbrite wrote down the names without emphasis. The list was already beginning to sound like Flaxborough, respectable, familiar, and just crowded enough to make certainty awkward. He closed his notebook. "Thank you," he said to Mrs. Mounsey, as though she had provided something more valuable than indignation. "We shall begin with the simplest thing. I would like to see the bank deposit slips for the last 6 weeks. Mrs. Bream reached for her envelope, her fingers perfectly steady. Yet in her thoughts a small image persisted. A receipt corner softened by handling, and the quiet suspicion that someone in Flaxborough had handled it rather more than they ought. The bank deposit slips for the last 6 weeks were produced with ceremonial care. Mrs. Bream laid them before Inspector Purbright in chronological order, as though the sequence itself might defend her. Each slip bore the stamp of the Flaxborough and District Savings Bank, a dependable institution whose solidity was often cited in conversation as proof that the town itself could not possibly harbour irregularity. Perbrite compared the slips with the ledger entries, his finger moving quietly down columns of figures. The rain continued its patient tapping at the chapel windows, as if counting along. "The deposits correspond," he observed after a moment, "with one exception." Mrs. Bream leaned forward, her composure tightening by a degree. "An exception? The first Tuesday in March," he said, "the ledger records a deposit of £340. The bank slip records 140. The silence that followed was thinner than before. "That cannot be correct," Mrs. Bream said at once. "I would never, I am sure you would not," Perbrite replied mildly. "The question is whether the discrepancy occurred in the ledger or before the deposit was made." Mr. Peart's spectacles slipped again. "Are you suggesting that Mrs. Bream miswrote the figure?" "I am suggesting nothing yet," said Perbrite, "only that this is the first point at which the £200 might have separated from the fund." Mrs. Bream took the slip in her hands. The stamp was clear, the date was correct. Her own memory, usually as reliable as the parish clock, wavered unhelpfully. "I remember that day," she said slowly. "It was cold. The heating bill had just been paid. I counted the donations from the Lent appeal and the jumble sale." "And you were alone?" Perbrite asked. "Yes." He watched her face as she searched the scene in her mind. She was not performing. She was reconstructing. The distinction mattered. "Did anyone call upon you that morning?" he asked. She hesitated. Mr. Crimp did. He came about the scaffolding. He wished to discuss a possible increase in cost due to unforeseen stonework. Mr. Peart made a soft sound of distaste. "Unforeseen stonework is the builder's version of the weather. It arrives when convenient." Perbrite did not smile, but he noted the remark. "Was Mr. Crimp here in the vestry?" "Yes," said Mrs. Bream. "We spoke at this very table. The ledger was open because I had been reconciling accounts, and did he handle it?" "I believe he turned a page," she admitted, faintly troubled. "He said something about admiring good bookkeeping. I thought it was a polite observation." Perbrite nodded. Builders, he reflected, were not generally known for spontaneous admiration of ledgers. "And after he left?" he asked. "I completed the count, sealed the money in the envelope, and went to the bank." "Without interruption?" Mrs. Bream paused. A small frown appeared. "I stopped at the grapes. Only briefly. Mrs. Dalloway had promised a tin for the bake sale and had forgotten it. I collected it." Mr. Peart blinked. "You took the fund money into the grapes?" "It was in my handbag," she said defensively, securely fastened. Perbrite made another note. A handbag in a public house was not inherently scandalous, but it introduced variables. "And how long were you there?" he asked. 10 minutes. No more. He rose from his chair. "I should like to speak to Mr. Crimp and to Mrs. Dalloway," in that order. The Reverend Hale, who had thus far contributed only pious silence, cleared his throat. "Inspector, I cannot imagine that anyone would take from the chapel. It would be spiritually unwise. People rarely weigh spiritual consequences against immediate necessity," Perbrite said gently. "They weigh opportunity." He closed the ledger and returned it to Mrs. Bream. "For now I am inclined to think that the £200 did not vanish from this room at random. It likely altered course on that Tuesday." Mr. Pert shifted again, relieved perhaps that suspicion had found a date, if not yet a culprit. Mrs. Bream sat very straight, her mind replaying the visit from Mr. Crimp with new unease. She recalled his boots leaving faint traces of dust on the vestry tiles. She had not thought it significant. Now she wondered what else he might have left behind or taken. Perbrite stepped into the damp churchyard and paused, considering the sequence. A builder with a taste for cost adjustments, a treasurer with impeccable habits, a brief stop at the Grapes, and a deposit slip that recorded £140, where £340 had been intended. The simplest explanation would be miscalculation. Yet Mrs. Bream's arithmetic was unlikely to fail by precisely £200. As he crossed the square toward the station, he reflected that theft in Flaxborough seldom announced itself boldly. It preferred to borrow the appearance of error. The difficulty lay not in finding those who needed money, for that list was always longer than acknowledged, but in identifying who had believed themselves clever enough to take it unnoticed. Behind him, in the vestry, Mrs. Bream stood alone for a moment after the others had dispersed. Her gaze fell upon the softened corner of the scaffolding receipt. It seemed suddenly less a record of expenditure than a reminder that money, once counted, did not always remain obedient. Mr. Leonard Crimp received Inspector Purbright in the yard of Crimp and Son Builders, though there was no visible son and little suggestion that one had ever been successfully involved. The yard contained a disciplined confusion of timber, ladders, and a cement mixer whose presence implied ambition. Mr. Crimp himself possessed the genial solidity of a man accustomed to measuring walls and occasionally adjusting them. "Chapel roof," he said at once, wiping his hands on a cloth that surrendered little improvement. "Unfortunate business. Old stone always surprises you." "So I am told," Perbrite replied. "You called upon Mrs. Bream on the first Tuesday in March." "I did. Cost revision. Purely procedural." They moved into the small office adjoining the yard. It contained a desk, a kettle, and a framed certificate of reliability that appeared to have been awarded by a trade association equally fond of the word. "You were alone with her in the vestry?" Perbrite asked. "For 10 minutes, Crimp said, readily. "We discussed the additional bracing required. I showed her figures." "Did you examine the chapel ledger?" Crimp smiled faintly. "I admired it. Didn't examine it. I wouldn't know one column from another. Yet you noticed it. It was open. Hard not to." Perbrite regarded him without expression. "You have not been paid in full for the scaffolding deposit." "No," said Crimp, his tone sharpening slightly. "Half in advance. The remainder is due next month." "And you are content with that arrangement?" "As content as any man can be waiting for church money," Crimp said dryly. "It arrives with prayer and hesitation." There was no overt defensiveness in him, but neither was there innocence on display. He appeared instead to be calculating whether cooperation or mild affront would serve him better. "Did you see any money on the table that morning?" Perbrite asked. "No, just papers." "And did you leave before Mrs. Bream completed her accounting?" "Yes, I had another call." Perbrite thanked him and stepped back into the yard, where a labourer was stacking bricks with indifferent precision. Crimp watched him go with the narrowed gaze of a man assessing future inconvenience. From there, Perbrite walked to the Grapes. The public house carried the comfortable dimness of an establishment that believed in tradition over illumination. Mrs. Dalloway stood behind the bar, polishing a glass with purposeful concentration. "Inspector," she said, as if he were a novelty item recently delivered. "This is about the chapel, I suppose." "It is," he agreed. "Mrs. Bream called here on the first Tuesday in March." "She did." "For a cake tin? She was in a hurry. Did she bring her handbag?" Mrs. Dalloway's lips twitched. "She always brings her handbag." "And did she open it?" "I couldn't say. I was serving Mr. Pert at the time." Perbrite's eyebrow lifted almost imperceptibly. "Mr. Pert?" "Yes, he comes in most Tuesdays. A small sherry. Very small. He was here when she arrived." "And how long?" "Did she remain?" 10 minutes, perhaps less." "She spoke to my husband about the jumble sale. Nothing unusual." Perbrite let the silence extend just long enough to invite further detail. "Well," Mrs. Dalloway added, "there was a moment when her handbag slipped from the counter. Mr. Pert picked it up. Quite gentlemanly." "And the contents?" Perbrite asked. "I didn't inspect them," she said briskly. "We are not a curious establishment." He thanked her and turned toward the corner table where Mr. Pert now sat, summoned perhaps by coincidence or conscience. The assistant churchwarden rose at once. "I assume you've spoken to Crimp," he said, attempting casualness and missing it narrowly. "I have," Perbrite replied. "I understand you were here when Mrs. Bream called." "Yes, pure chance. And you assisted her when her handbag fell." Mr. Pert's face flushed faintly. "It was only courtesy." "Did the handbag open?" "I believe so." "Briefly. And did you observe its contents?" Pert hesitated. The pause was not long, but it carried weight. "I saw an envelope. Brown, sealed, marked. I think it bore the chapel's name. I didn't examine it closely." Perbrite studied him. Mr. Pert was not a man built for deception. His discomfort surfaced too readily. Yet discomfort did not equate to guilt. It might just as easily reflect proximity to suspicion. "And after Mrs. Bream left?" Perbrite asked. "I remained there for another 5 minutes. Then I returned home." "Did you leave before her?" "Yes." Perbrite inclined his head. "Thank you." Outside, the market square resumed its mild commerce, unaware that its rhythms were being measured. A builder with revised costs, a treasurer with an impeccable ledger, a churchwarden present at the precise moment a handbag containing chapel funds was dropped in a public house. The explanation that had first suggested itself as an error in arithmetic was now less persuasive than an error in trust. As Perbrite walked back toward the station, he reflected that the town had already begun to form its own conclusions. Crimp was an outsider of sorts, tolerated but not embraced. Mr. Pert was solid and dull, which some equated with honesty and others with hidden resentment. Mrs. Bream herself possessed authority, and authority could provoke quiet retaliation. The £200 had vanished between vestry and bank. Whether it had changed hands in a builder's office or a public house remained uncertain. But it had, he felt increasingly sure, been handled by someone who believed the town too polite to look closely. Inspector Perbrite did not return immediately to the station. Instead, he crossed the square once more and paused outside the bank, studying its modest facade with the reflective air of a man considering whether institutions possessed personalities. The Flaxborough and District Savings Bank prided itself on discretion, a quality much admired in a town where curiosity was industrious but rarely admitted. Inside, the manager, Mr. Alderton, received him with professional smoothness. He was a thin man with a moustache that seemed to have been trained to imply fiscal reliability. "I understand you wish to confirm a deposit," Mr. Alderton said, already anticipating paperwork. "The first Tuesday in March," Perbrite replied. "Chapel Restoration Fund, £140. That is correct, said Alderton at once. The slip is here. He produced it with a quiet flourish. The handwriting on the deposit slip was not Mrs. Bream's precise script, but a bank clerk's. The amount had been entered in ink. The figures were clean and unambiguous. "And no alteration?" Perbrite asked mildly. "None. The amount received was £140. Do you recall who made the deposit?" "Mrs. Bream herself. She is punctual." Perbrite considered this. "Was the money presented in a sealed envelope?" "Yes." She handed it over as usual. "Did she open it in your presence?" Mr. Alderton frowned faintly. "No, she placed it on the counter." "I opened it." "And counted the contents?" "Of course." "Did you remark upon the sum?" Alderton's frown deepened into recollection. "As I recall, she seemed slightly distracted. I mentioned that the amount was lower than the previous week. She said it was due to seasonal variation. Perbrite allowed that detail to settle. Mrs. Bream, distracted. Seasonal variation. It was not her usual language. "Did she appear surprised at the sum?" he asked. "I would not say surprised," Alderton replied cautiously. "Perhaps preoccupied." Perbrite thanked him and stepped back into the square. The rain had lifted, leaving the cobbles reflective and mildly accusatory. The sequence now felt firmer. Mrs. Bream had intended to deposit £340. Only 140 had reached the bank. The error had not been corrected at the counter. Either she had miscounted before leaving the vestry, or the envelope's contents had altered between vestry and bank. He turned over the possibilities with quiet persistence. If Mrs. Bream had miscounted, she would have discovered it the moment the bank clerk declared the total. She was not inattentive. Yet Alderton described her as distracted, not shocked. Had she assumed she had miscalculated, or had she not wished to draw attention to a discrepancy? He walked slowly toward the chapel, retracing the path she would have taken that Tuesday. Vestry to square, square to the grapes to bank. Each step presented an opportunity, but opportunity required motive. At the corner near the post office he paused. A small detail, mentioned almost in passing by Mrs. Dalloway, returned to him, the handbag slipping from the counter. Mr. Pert, lifting it. The envelope is briefly visible. He turned instead toward Mr. Pert's residence, a narrow house whose curtains suggested a life arranged carefully against intrusion. Mr. Pert opened the door himself as though expecting a second visit. "Inspector," he said, attempting composure and achieving something adjacent to it. "I hope this is merely procedural." "It is always procedural," Perbrite replied, stepping inside. They sat in a small parlour whose ornaments were arranged with mathematical precision. On the mantel stood a photograph of Mr. Pert receiving a civic certificate for volunteer service. The frame gleamed. "I would like to clarify something," Perbrite said. "When Mrs. Bream's handbag fell, you assisted her." "Yes. Did you notice whether the envelope inside was sealed securely?" "I believe so. Was it heavy?" Mr. Pert blinked. "Heavy?" "Yes. Did it appear full?" Pert hesitated, and the hesitation lingered longer than comfort allowed. It seemed substantial. "And yet," Perbrite continued evenly, "when Mrs. Bream reached the bank, it contained £200 less than intended." Pert's face reddened. "Are you implying—" "I imply nothing," said Perbrite. "I observe that you were present at the only known interruption between vestry and bank." Pert rose, agitated. "I am a churchwarden. I have given years to that chapel." "I am aware," Perbrite said calmly. "Years do not preclude moments." The words hung in the small room. Pert's agitation was not theatrical. It was wounded. Yet wounded pride and injured innocence often resembled one another. After a moment, Pert sank back into his chair. "I did not touch the money. Did anyone else approach the counter while the handbag was open?" Perbrite asked. Pert closed his eyes briefly. searching memory. Cyril Dalloway came from the back. He joked about chapel funds being safer in the grapes than in heaven. Mrs. Bream laughed. I picked up the bag, that is all. Perbright noted the remark carefully. Jokes in Flaxborough were rarely unconsidered. He rose. Thank you, Mr. Pert. As he stepped back into the street, his thoughts aligned with increasing clarity. The trivial detail of a fallen handbag was no longer trivial. It was the only moment when money, motive, and multiple witnesses intersected. The town would soon favour the simplest suspect. The builder with revised costs was an obvious candidate, but the simplest suspect was not always the correct one. The £200 had vanished in plain sight, perhaps under the guise of courtesy, perhaps beneath the cover of humour. And somewhere between a vestry table and a public house counter, someone had decided that the Chapel Restoration Fund could withstand a small, private restoration of their own. Inspector Perbrite did not immediately pursue Mr. Cyril Dalloway. Instead, he returned to the chapel vestry in the late afternoon, when the light through the narrow windows had softened and the air carried the faint chill of stone surrendering the day's warmth. He preferred, when possible, to revisit the scene without its previous occupants. Rooms, like people, often altered their manner when left alone. The ledger lay where Mrs. Bream had replaced it, its spine straight, its pages aligned. Perbrite opened it again to the entry for the first Tuesday in March. The figure £340 stood in Mrs. Bream's careful script, unhesitating. He compared the ink with earlier entries. There was no sign of alteration, no correction, no overwriting. If error had occurred, it had been committed in certainty. He moved to the drawer beneath the table and examined its contents. Spare envelopes, a box of paper clips, a small tin of sealing wax, its lid slightly askew. He lifted it and noticed that the wax had been used recently. Its surface bore a shallow indentation, not fully smoothed. Mrs. Bream had said she sealed the envelope before leaving for the bank. The bank manager had confirmed that he opened it at the counter. Yet neither had mentioned a wax seal, only an envelope. Perbrite replaced the tin thoughtfully. He walked to the vestry door and tested the lock. It functioned properly. 3 keys existed, one for the vicar, one for Mr. Pert, one for Mrs. Mountsie. Access was not unlimited, but neither was it rare. Footsteps sounded in the corridor. Mrs. Mountsie appeared, carrying a folded duster with the solemnity of office. "You've come back," she observed, not displeased. "I wish to confirm something," Perbrite said, "when you clean in here. Do you ever remove items from the drawer?" She bristled faintly. "Certainly not. I wipe the surfaces. I do not rummage. And have you noticed whether Mrs. Bream seals envelopes with wax?" Mrs. Mountsie paused. "Sometimes. For larger sums. She considers it dignified. Did she do so recently?" "I could not say. I do not supervise her correspondence." Perbrite inclined his head. "Of course." As he left the chapel, he found Mr. Cyril Dalloway leaning against the railings of the Grapes, engaged in animated conversation with a pair of market traders. Dalloway possessed the restless charm of a man who disliked silence and mistrusted it in others. "Inspector," he called out lightly, "you're making us all feel most significant." "I should hope not excessively," Perbrite replied. "Might we speak?" They stepped aside to the edge of the square. Dalloway folded his arms, smiling with practised ease. "I understand you were present when Mrs. Bream visited the Grapes on the first Tuesday in March," Perbrite said. "Present is a strong word," Dalloway laughed. "I was nearby. Everyone is nearby in Flaxborough. And you made a remark about chapel funds being safer here than in heaven." Dalloway's smile faltered by a degree. "A joke. Surely that's not a crime?" "No," Perbrite agreed. though jokes often reveal proximity. To what? To opportunity? Dalloway's expression sharpened. Are you suggesting I would steal from the chapel? I am suggesting that the envelope containing the fund was visible when Mrs. Bream's handbag fell. Mr. Pert picked it up. You were close enough to comment. Dalloway's gaze flicked toward the grapes, then back. If I'd wanted it, I'd have had to snatch it from under Pert's nose. He's many things, but he's not inattentive. Yet you were behind the bar at one point, Perbrite said quietly. Mrs. Dalloway mentioned you came from the back? For a crate, Dalloway replied quickly. Not for envelopes. Perbrite watched him in silence. Dalloway's confidence returned with effort. You're chasing shadows, Dalloway said. If money's gone missing, look at the books. Builders pay invoices, treasurers miscount. But I don't take what isn't mine. Do you require £200? Perbrite asked mildly. Dalloway's jaw tightened. Who doesn't? It was an honest answer, delivered with irritation rather than guilt. Yet honesty did not absolve motive. Perbrite thanked him and withdrew, leaving Dalloway to resume his performance for the traders, though the laughter that followed was fractionally forced. As evening settled over the square, Perbrite walked slowly back toward the station. The sequence had narrowed but not resolved. Mrs. Bream's ledger showed £340. The bank received £140. The interruption occurred at the grapes. 3 individuals were present when the handbag fell. One had lifted it, another had approached the counter, all professed innocence with varying degrees of indignation. And there remained the wax. If Mrs. Bream had sealed the envelope in the vestry, then any alteration would require breaking and resealing. Yet neither she nor the bank manager had mentioned a seal. Either it had not been used that day, or it had been removed without notice. Perbrite paused beneath the lamplight outside the station. The trivial detail that had first drawn his interest, the softened corner of the scaffolding receipt, returned to mind. It suggested handling, repeated handling. By someone who had reason to revisit that page. Money could vanish through error, but it could also vanish through calculation, and calculation in Flaxborough often wore the face of respectability. By the following morning, the disappearance of the £200 had matured into a civic pastime. Flaxborough, which had always prided itself on restraint, was discovering that moral concern could be expressed with considerable animation provided it was framed as disappointment. Inspector Perbrite began the day at the station with a small stack of notes and a larger silence. The detail of the sealing wax remained obstinately inconclusive. Mrs. Bream could not recall with certainty whether she had sealed the envelope that Tuesday. The bank manager was equally certain he had not broken any seal. If wax had been used, it had not travelled as far as the counter. That suggested the envelope may never have been sealed at all. He returned once more to the vestry, not to inspect the ledger, but to speak again with Mrs. Bream under slightly altered emphasis. You mentioned, he said gently, that you sometimes seal larger sums with wax. Would £340 qualify? She hesitated. Ordinarily, yes, it is substantial. And on that Tuesday, I cannot be certain. I was interrupted by Mr. Crimp. We discussed the scaffolding. I may have delayed sealing it until after he left. Did you leave the envelope unattended at any point? She frowned. Only when I stepped into the corridor to fetch a receipt from the filing cabinet. A minute at most. And the envelope remained on the table? Yes. Perbrite absorbed this quietly. A minute was sufficient for temptation, insufficient for elaborate theft, unless the sum had already been misrepresented before the interruption. Mrs. Bream, he said after a moment, how confident are you that the total you recorded, £340, was correct before Mr. Crimp arrived? Her expression tightened, not in offence but in self-scrutiny. "I counted it twice." "And did you count it again after he left?" She closed her eyes briefly. "No, I sealed it, or believed I did, and placed it in my handbag. It was not negligence, it was routine. And routine, Perbrite reflected, was often the thief's accomplice. From the chapel he walked to Mr. Crimp's yard once more. This time he asked not about scaffolding, but about timing. "You left the vestry before Mrs. Bream completed her accounting," he said. "Yes." "And you did not return that day?" "No. Have you ever handled chapel funds?" Crimp laughed shortly. "Not unless you count invoices. Did you notice whether the envelope was sealed?" Crimp's brow furrowed. "I don't recall seeing any envelope." Perbrite studied him. It was possible that he truly had not observed it. It was equally possible that he had observed too much. From there, Perbrite proceeded to the grapes again, this time seeking Mrs. Dalloway alone. He found her arranging bottles with unnecessary precision. "You said Mrs. Bream's handbag slipped from the counter?" he began. "It did." "And Mr. Pert lifted it?" "Yes." "Where were you standing?" "Behind the bar. And your
husband?" "In the back room. He came out for the crate." Perbrite nodded. "Did anyone else approach the counter while the handbag was open?" She hesitated. "Not that I recall. Did you see inside the envelope?" "No. Did you see Mr. Pert see inside it?" Her composure faltered for the briefest instant. He glanced, perhaps. "Anyone would." "Anyone would," Perbrite repeated mildly. When he left the grapes, the square felt smaller than before. The list of possible hands had not grown, but their movements had become clearer. The envelope lay unattended in the vestry for a minute. It travelled in Mrs. Bream's handbag. It fell upon a public house counter. It was lifted by Mr. Pert. Mr. Dalloway stood nearby. Opportunity existed in both locations, yet only one offered privacy enough to remove £200 without spectacle. Perbrite paused by the post office, watching as Mr. Pert emerged from within, a small parcel under his arm. The churchwarden walked with careful deliberation, as
though conscious that his steps might be observed. He turned toward his narrow house and entered without looking back. It was a modest dwelling, maintained with diligence rather than ease. Perbrite recalled the mantelpiece certificate, the polished frame, the ornaments aligned precisely. Mr. Pert valued order, and perhaps, he reflected, he valued recognition. Later that afternoon, Perbrite requested from the bank a list of recent deposits made by Mr. Pert in his personal account. The manager, discreet but compliant, confirmed that on the Wednesday, following the disputed Tuesday, Mr. Pert had deposited £200 in cash. The sum was not extraordinary, it was not unprecedented, yet it was recent. Perbrite closed the file and leaned back in his chair. The town would soon prefer a straightforward culprit. The builder's revised costs still hovered in conversation, but the builder had not deposited £200 the following day. There remained the question of access in the vestry, a minute alone, an envelope unsealed, a churchwarden accustomed to witnessing counts, familiar with the rhythm of donations, and present later when the handbag fell close enough to confirm whether anything had been noticed. The evidence was not yet conclusive. It was merely suggestive, and in Flaxborough, suggestions handled with patience were often enough to disturb the most carefully arranged life. Inspector Perbrite did not immediately confront Mr. Pert with the information from the bank. In Flaxborough, direct accusation was a tool best used sparingly. A man who felt cornered tended to barricade himself behind injured respectability. Instead, Perbrite requested a meeting of the Chapel Restoration Committee for the following evening, citing the need to clarify certain procedural matters. The phrasing caused predictable agitation. By 7 o'clock the vestry was occupied once more, Mrs. Bream upright and composed, Reverend Hale folded into anxious benevolence, Mrs. Mounsey rigid with anticipatory vindication, Mr. Crimp solid and faintly resentful, Mr. and Mrs. Dalloway seated with theatrical neutrality, and Mr. Pert, who had chosen a darker suit than usual, as though colour itself might draw attention. Perbrite stood near the table rather than sitting at it. The ledger lay open, its columns serene. "I am grateful to you all for attending," he began. "The purpose of this meeting is not accusation, but clarity. The £200 did not evaporate, it altered its course." A murmur passed around the small room. "I have confirmed," he continued, "that on the first Tuesday in March, the chapel fund ledger recorded a deposit of £340. The bank received 140. The discrepancy of £200 occurred before the envelope reached the counter. Mrs. Bream's fingers tightened lightly upon her gloves. Mr. Crimp's jaw shifted. Mr. Pert stared fixedly at the ledger as if willing it to adjust itself. "Mrs. Bream," Perbrite said gently, "you were interrupted during your count by Mr. Crimp." Crimp straightened. "I did not touch any money. I'm not suggesting you did," Perbrite replied. "After your departure," Mrs. Bream stepped into the corridor briefly, leaving the envelope on the table. Mrs. Mounsey inhaled sharply, as though negligence had been confirmed as a moral failing. "That moment," Perbrite went on, "provided the only opportunity for the envelope to be altered in private." Mr. Pert's head lifted. "I was not present then." "No," Perbrite agreed. "You were not." The room stilled. The implication hung carefully, not yet directed. However, Perbrite continued. "When Mrs. Bream later visited the Grapes, the envelope was visible again. Mr. Pert assisted her when her handbag fell. Pert shifted in his seat, only as a courtesy, of course. And Mr. Dalloway was present." Dalloway spread his hands lightly. "I made a foolish joke. Nothing more." Perbrite inclined his head. "Yes, a joke about the safety of chapel funds." He allowed the silence to lengthen. "I have also confirmed," he said at last, "that on the day following that Tuesday, £200 were deposited into a private account at the Flaxborough and District Savings Bank. The statement was delivered without emphasis, yet it altered the air in the vestry." Mrs. Bream's gaze flicked involuntarily toward Mr. Pert. Mr. Crimp exhaled audibly. Mrs. Mounsey's posture acquired a certain grim triumph. Pert's face was drained of colour. "Are you suggesting I am observing," Perbrite said quietly, "that the amount corresponds exactly with the discrepancy?" "That proves nothing," Pert said, his voice tightening. "I had savings." "Certainly," Perbrite replied, "and you may have had reason to consolidate them." Reverend Hale cleared his throat anxiously. "Inspector, surely we are not—" Perbrite raised a hand slightly. "There is one further point. The ledger entry for £340 is written with confidence." Mrs. Bream counted twice before Mr. Crimp's interruption. "It is unlikely she erred by precisely £200. Mrs. Bream nodded faintly, her composure strained, but intact. "If the error did not occur in her arithmetic," Perbrite continued, "it occurred in the handling of the envelope." All eyes now rested upon Mr. Pert. He swallowed. "I have served this chapel for years." "Yes," Perbrite said. "You have witnessed counts. You understand the rhythm of donations. You knew approximately what sum should be present." Pert's hands clenched upon his knees. "You cannot prove I took it in the vestry. I was not there." "No," Perbrite agreed, "but you were present later, when the envelope was visible again. You saw that it contained a substantial sum. You had reason to believe it would not be recounted before reaching the bank." Pert's breath grew shallow. "I did not." "And the following day," Perbrite said evenly, "you deposited £200. Say, room seemed to contract around the figure. Pert rose abruptly, knocking his chair back against the wall. It was my money, mine. Of course, Perbrite said, but it is unfortunate that it resembles precisely the amount removed from the chapel fund. Silence settled, thick and expectant. Outside, a church bell marked the hour with deliberate calm. Pert's gaze moved from face to face. Mrs. Bream's wounded disbelief, Mrs. Mountse's stern satisfaction, Reverend Hale's stricken confusion, respectability, once his armour, now felt like scrutiny. Perbrite did not press further. He allowed the weight of coincidence to rest where it must. In Flaxborough, guilt rarely declared itself loudly. It revealed itself in the tremor of a voice, the tightening of a jaw, the calculation of escape routes that no longer existed. And in the vestry of St. Bartholomew's, the figure of £200 had become more than arithmetic. It had become a measure of character. The vestry remained, suspended in a silence that seemed to hum faintly with accusation. Mr. Pert stood motionless beside his overturned chair, as though the act of sitting again might constitute surrender. Inspector Perbrite did not move toward him. Instead, he gently righted the chair and placed it back in position, a small gesture of order in a room that had begun to lose it. "Mr. Pert," he said quietly, "no one here wishes for spectacle. We wish only for truth." Pert's composure, which had frayed visibly during Perbrite's recital of bank figures, now showed the strain of something deeper than indignation. His eyes settled not on the inspector but on the ledger, the neat columns, the unwavering handwriting, the quiet authority of arithmetic. "It was never meant as theft," he said at last, his voice lower and less defensive. "It was temporary." Mrs. Bream inhaled sharply. Reverend Hale closed his eyes as though prayer might yet reverse time. "Temporary?" Perbrite prompted gently. "I intended to replace it before the next committee meeting," Pert continued, speaking rapidly now, as though explanation might outrun consequence. "My sister in Norwich required assistance. Unexpected medical expenses. I had savings, but they were tied up in a fixed account. I believed foolishly that I could bridge the gap. £200 for a fortnight. No one would notice." Mrs. Mountse's lips compressed into a line of austere satisfaction. "And yet," Perbrite said, "the discrepancy was noticed." "Yes." Pert's shoulders sagged. "Because I misjudged Mrs. Bream's vigilance." Mrs. Bream stiffened slightly, uncertain whether to regard this as compliment or rebuke. Perbrite allowed the confession to settle. "When did you take it?" "In the vestry," Pert said, scarcely above a whisper. "When Mrs. Bream stepped into the corridor, the envelope lay open. I removed £200. I intended to reseal it, but there was no wax prepared. I closed it and returned it to the table." "And at the grapes?" Perbrite asked. Pert gave a hollow laugh. "I panicked when the handbag fell. I thought the envelope might be counted there and then, but no one looked closely." Cyril Dalloway shifted uneasily. "You might have said something," he muttered, though whether to Pert or to himself was unclear. "I might have done many things," Pert replied, his tone brittle with belated clarity. Reverend Hale stepped forward at last, his voice trembling with restrained dismay. "Edwin, you have served this chapel faithfully for years." "I know," Pert said. "That was why I thought it would not matter. I have given so much time. I believed I was owed—" "No, not owed," he corrected himself quickly. "Trusted." Mrs. Bream regarded him steadily. "Trust is not divisible, Mr. Pert. One does not borrow from it and expect the balance to remain intact." Perbrite nodded slightly. "And the deposit to your account the following day?" "My own savings," Pert replied. "I withdrew from a different source and replaced what I had taken." "But by then the ledger had been checked." "You did not return the 200 to the chapel fund," Perbrite observed. "I meant to," Pert said again, though the repetition sounded increasingly hollow. The vestry seemed smaller than before, its stone walls drawing inward upon the revelation. Outside, the square continued its quiet business, unaware that within these walls a man's reputation had altered by precisely £200. "There will be formalities," Perbrite said gently. "The money must be returned. The committee will decide upon your position." Pert nodded, his expression no longer defensive, but resigned. "I will repay it, at once." Mrs. Mountsea's gaze softened fractionally. Even vindication had its limits. Mrs. Dalloway looked thoughtful rather than triumphant. Crimp, arms folded, appeared faintly disappointed that the matter had not been more elaborate. Perbrite closed the ledger carefully. "This was not a crime of desperation," he said, quietly. "It was a crime
of assumption. You assumed that familiarity with trust permitted temporary deviation." Pert lowered his eyes. As the committee dispersed, each member carried away a slightly altered view of the town and of themselves. The builder returned to his yard, relieved of suspicion. The Dalloways resumed their bar with subdued conversation. Mrs. Bream gathered the papers with steady hands, though something in her expression had hardened imperceptibly. Perbrite remained a moment longer in the vestry. The arithmetic now aligned: 340 records, 140 deposited, 200 diverted, and later concealed within a private account. It was simple, almost disappointingly so, yet simplicity did not diminish consequence. When he stepped into the evening air, the church bell rang again, untroubled by human irregularity. Flaxborough would speak of the incident in lowered tones for a week, perhaps 2. Then routine would resume its quiet dominion. But the knowledge
would remain that even in a town devoted to modest virtues, trust could be adjusted as easily as a ledger entry and restored with considerably more difficulty. The formal return of the £200 took place with a ceremony more restrained than the fete which had revealed its absence. Mr. Pert arrived at the vestry the following morning, carrying an envelope that was sealed this time with conspicuous wax. He handed it to Mrs. Bream without flour. "The full amount," he said, "in cash." Mrs. Bream accepted it with the same measured composure she applied to all financial matters. She did not open it immediately. Instead, she placed it upon the table and looked at him steadily. "I shall recount it presently," she said, not from mistrust, but from habit. Pert inclined his head. Habit, in this context, was not a neutral word. Reverend Hale stood between them like an anxious mediator in a minor diplomatic crisis. "We must consider the spirit of forgiveness," he began gently. "The spirit," Mrs. Mountseat interjected from the doorway, "is not in question. The position of assistant churchwarden is." The committee reconvened briefly. There were no raised voices. Flaxborough conducted its disappointments in subdued tones. It was agreed that Mr. Pert would resign his post with immediate effect. The phrase "in the interests of the chapel" was employed with careful diplomacy. Pert listened without protest. The confession of the previous evening had drained him of argument. When the decision was announced, he nodded once, as though confirming a calculation long suspected. Inspector Perbrite attended not as arbiter but as witness. He observed the proceedings with quiet detachment, intervening only to confirm that the matter would not proceed to formal prosecution provided the restitution remained complete and no further irregularities were discovered. "I have no desire to see the town embarrassed beyond necessity," he said. "The lesson appears sufficient." Mrs. Bream finally opened the envelope and counted its contents with precise deliberation. £200. Exactly. She replaced it within a new envelope, sealed it with wax, and set it aside for deposit. "Next Tuesday," she said firmly. After the meeting dispersed, Perbrite walked with Reverend Hale across the square. The vicar's relief was evident but tempered by lingering distress. "Such a small sum," Hale murmured, "and yet such a consequence." "Small sums test character," Perbrite replied. "Large sums merely magnify it." Hale considered this in thoughtful silence. At the Grapes, news of the resignation had already preceded them. Cyril Dalloway leaned across the bar to recount the development with a mixture of satisfaction and self-justification. "I always said it wasn't crimp," he declared, to a pair of attentive patrons. "You can spot a builder's dishonesty at 50 paces. This was something subtler." Mrs. Dalloway glanced at him with restrained irony. "Yes," she said dryly, "subtlety is very much our local speciality." Mr. Crimp, upon hearing of the resolution, expressed practical sympathy and little else. "Shouldn't have mixed personal matters with church money," he said. "Never ends well." In his narrow house, Mr. Pert removed the civic certificate from his mantelpiece and placed it in a drawer. The gesture was not dramatic. It was merely quiet, and therefore more final. Inspector Perbrite returned to the station and completed his report with minimal embellishment. The facts were plain, the motive was modest, the town's equilibrium, though disturbed, had not shattered. Yet something had shifted. When Mrs. Bream deposited the restored sum the following Tuesday, she did so accompanied by Mrs. Mountsie. The envelope was sealed, the count was performed twice. At the bank counter she observed the clerk as he tallied the notes, her gaze steady and unblinking. Trust, once adjusted, required reinforcement. As the week progressed, the incident receded into anecdote. Conversations in the market square returned to weather and council taxes. The chapel roof continued its slow restoration. The ledger's columns resumed their orderly progression, unmarred by further discrepancy. Inspector Purbright, however, retained a mild reflection upon the matter. The theft had not arisen from desperation, nor from grand vice. It had emerged from familiarity, the quiet conviction that one's reputation could absorb a temporary deviation. Flaxborough would remember that for some time, and in the vestry of St. Bartholomew's, beneath the scent of polish and hymnals, the arithmetic now balanced once more, though the sum of trust, like all such accounts, remained permanently altered. The week after Mr. Pert's resignation, St. Bartholomew's resumed its customary calm, though the calm possessed a slightly revised texture. The roofers continued their patient ascent and descent of the scaffolding. Mrs. Bream's ledger entries advanced with renewed vigilance, and the Ladies' Committee discovered that indignation, when properly moderated, could be repurposed into efficiency. Inspector Perbrite did not consider the matter entirely closed until he had spoken once more with Mr. Pert, not as suspect, but as a citizen. He called at the narrow house on a quiet afternoon, when the square was preoccupied with a delivery of cabbages. Pert received him without surprise. He looked older by a week, as though arithmetic could mark time more severely than the calendar. "I will not detain you long," Perbrite said. "There is one point I would like clarified." Pert inclined his head, accepting the inevitability of inquiry. "When you removed the £200 in the vestry," Perbrite said, "you did so before the envelope was sealed." "Yes." "And you closed it without wax?" "I did." Yet Mrs. Bream believed she had sealed it. Pert gave a faint, rueful smile. "She seals larger sums as a matter of dignity. I suppose she assumed she had done so, habit again." Perbrite regarded him steadily. "You relied upon that habit." Pert did not deny it. "And at the Grapes," Perbrite continued, "you ensured that no one examined the envelope too closely." Pert's expression tightened briefly. "When the handbag fell, I picked it up at once. I thought if anyone saw the contents, the count might be questioned immediately. I told myself I would restore the money before Tuesday. but when the ledger was checked sooner than expected, it was too late. Too late to return it unnoticed, Perbrite corrected gently. Yes. There was no defensiveness left in him now, only weary candour. Why not confess at once? Perbrite asked. Pert's gaze moved to the window where the afternoon light rested without accusation. Because I have been an assistant churchwarden for 12 years, because I believed that one lapse would not outweigh years of service, and because I was ashamed. Perbrite nodded. Shame often arrives after calculation. Pert's mouth twitched faintly. You are kinder than I deserve, Inspector. Kindness has nothing to do with it, Perbrite replied. Clarity does. When he left the house, Perbrite felt no triumph. The case had required neither ingenuity nor dramatic pursuit. It had required patience and attention to small deviations, an unsealed envelope, a private deposit, a misplaced confidence. That evening, the Chapel Restoration Committee met briefly to confirm that the returned sum had been deposited and that no further discrepancies existed. Mrs. Bream reported that the ledger now balanced precisely. Her voice, though steady, carried a note of resolution, sharpened by experience. We shall institute a new practice, she announced. 2 signatures for every count, and no envelope shall leave this vestry without being sealed in the presence of a witness. Mrs. Mountsie approved audibly. Reverend Hale murmured assent. Cyril Dalloway, informed later at the Grapes, remarked that the chapel now possessed more safeguards than the crown jewels. His wife observed that such precautions were generally adopted after jewels had gone missing. In the days that followed, conversation in Flaxborough shifted from accusation to anecdote. Mr. Peart's name was mentioned less frequently, and then not at all. He was seen occasionally in the square, moving with a quieter step. Some greeted him kindly, others with measured civility. The town, having exercised its moral muscles, returned to lighter exertions. Inspector Perbrite completed his final memorandum and placed it within the station file marked Chapel Fund. The paper contained no flourish, no moralizing, only facts aligned as neatly as Mrs. Bream's columns. Before leaving for the evening, he paused by the window and regarded the square. Trust, he reflected, was much like a ledger entry, easily altered, laboriously restored, and forever subject to scrutiny once disturbed. The church bell sounded for an hour, its tone carried evenly across the market, indifferent to human miscalculation. St. Bartholomew's stood unchanged in brick and stone, though within its vestry habits had shifted and vigilance had deepened. The £200 had been returned. The arithmetic is balanced, yet the true adjustment had not been monetary. It lay in the knowledge that even in a town devoted to modest virtue, the temptation to borrow from trust could arise quietly, and that restoration, once required, demanded more than repayment. Inspector Perbrite extinguished the station lamp and stepped into the evening, leaving behind a file closed, not with drama, but with understanding.